Albania, a small country tucked along the Adriatic coast that most people couldn't find on a map without hesitating. A language that resembles nothing else spoken anywhere in Europe. A history so tangled in invasion, occupation, and erasure that scholars spent 2 centuries arguing bitterly over who Albanians actually are and where they actually came from. And then, finally, science stepped us in. Ancient DNA pulled out of bones thousands of years old gave researchers something written records could never provide, a direct, unbroken line into the past. What they found was not what anyone expected going in, not a simple medieval migration story, not a tidy arrival narrative borrowed from an old textbook, but something far older, far more continuous, and far more remarkable than the history books had ever suggested. In this video, we're going to walk through the complete genetic origin story of the Albanian people, start to finish. We'll look at where Albanians actually live today and why their diaspora is one of the largest relative to population size anywhere in the world. We'll get into the linguistic mystery that baffled European scholars for generations, a puzzle nobody could crack with words alone. We'll walk through the fierce historical debate between competing origin theories, a debate that was never just academic, and then we'll bring in the DNA itself, the actual ancient genetic data from one of the largest population studies ever conducted on this part of Europe. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Albanian DNA carries a secret that took modern genomic science to finally expose. Stick with me to the end, because the story is genuinely worth it. Here's a number that catches most people off guard the first time they hear it. There are roughly 5 million Albanians alive in the world today, but only about 8 million of them actually live inside the borders of Albania itself. That means the majority of an entire ethnic group lives scattered outside the country that carries their name. Sit with that for a second. The bulk of a people spread across the globe, still holding on to language, culture, and identity, often generations removed from the physical soil their name is tied to. Forbes has ranked Albania 3rd in the entire world for the size of its diaspora relative to its home population, behind only Guyana and Bosnia. You'll find sizable Albanian communities scattered across Italy, Greece, Turkey, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, Canada, and Australia. And in Kosovo, a territory with its own deeply fraught and complicated political history. More than 90% of the population identifies as ethnically Albanian. That is not a small minority community holding on by its fingernails in someone else's country. That is a dominant population sitting in the middle of one of the most contested pieces of land in modern Europe. And that fact alone tells you something important about just how far Albanian identity has reached and how stubbornly it has persisted. When scientists first began investigating Albanian genetic origins in earnest, they weren't looking at some tiny, isolated mountain population tucked away in a forgotten corner of the map, cut off from the currents of history. They were looking at one of the most geographically widespread and historically persistent peoples in all of Europe. A population that survived 5 centuries under Ottoman rule, absorbed wave after wave of foreign domination, and made it through the chaos of the 20th century without ever losing the thread of who they were. That kind of survival doesn't happen by accident. Understanding exactly how it happened, both genetically and culturally, is really the whole point of what we're about to walk through. To understand why Albanian survival is so remarkable, you first have to understand exactly where Albanians have been living all this time. The Balkans isn't just a geographic region on a map. It is one of the most fought over, carved up, and repeatedly remade territories in the entire span of human history. Empires didn't just pass through the Balkans on their way somewhere else. They collided there again and again. The Romans absorbed the region into their empire. The Byzantines held onto it for centuries afterward. The Slavs migrated in from the north during the 6th and 7th centuries, reshaping languages and cultures across the entire peninsula in the process. The Ottomans arrived in the 14th century and didn't leave for 500 years. After them came the nationalist movements of the 19th century, the brutal Balkan Wars, too worldy. Wars that tore through the region, and then the violent dissolution of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, which reopened wounds that many people thought had long since closed. Every single one of those chapters left a mark on the people living through it. Populations were displaced. Some were absorbed into larger groups. Others were converted, culturally or religiously, and some were simply replaced outright. Languages disappeared entirely. Whole ethnic communities were erased from regions they had occupied for generations, sometimes within the span of a single lifetime. In an environment like that, maintaining a distinct identity across thousands of years wasn't some given, some inevitable outcome. It was extraordinary. Most populations across the Balkans today show clear, unmistakable genetic breaks in their DNA record. Specific moments where large-scale migration, significantly Spanish, French, and Italian all share a common mother language in Latin. English and German are close cousins. Polish and Russian are practically siblings. Even Greek and Hindi, despite being separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, share an ancient common ancestor if you trace the branches back far enough. The entire Indo-European language family is a vast interconnected web, and almost every language spoken in Europe fits somewhere inside that web, connected by clear, traceable threads to something else nearby. Now, here's the strange part about Albanian. It does belong to that same Indo-European family, right alongside all of those other languages, but it sits completely alone on its own branch of the family tree. No close relatives, no sister language anywhere on the continent that it clearly split off from. Linguists call this a language isolate within a larger family. And for Albanian specifically, that isolation isn't just a technical curiosity buried in an academic footnote. It's one of the deepest unresolved mysteries in the entire field of European linguistics. And here's where it gets even stranger. Roughly half of all Albanian vocabulary is actually made up of borrowed words, pulled in over centuries from Latin, Greek, Turkish, and various Slavic languages. Every single empire that ever moved through Albanian territory left words behind in the language, like sediment settling in a riverbed. But the core grammar and the oldest layer of vocabulary underneath all those borrowed words resisted that outside influence almost completely. That core belongs to something ancient, something that predates every one of those later outside influences by a very long stretch of time. The oldest surviving written document in the Albanian language dates all the way to 1462, a single page, a baptismal formula embedded inside a pastoral letter written by the Archbishop of Durrës, Pal Engjeli, one page. That is the entire surviving written record for a language that millions of people were actively speaking across a significant stretch of the Balkans for centuries. Before that, the reason for that gap is fairly simple once you understand it. Albanian speakers were, for the overwhelming majority of their history, rural mountain communities, shepherds and clan-based societies with essentially no direct connection to the literate courts of Rome, Byzantium, or the various Slavic kingdoms that rose and fell around them. The language lived almost entirely in mouths, passed from parent to child by speech, never committed to paper in any meaningful volume. And that near total silence in the written historical record is exactly why historians ended up arguing so ferociously for so long about where Albanians actually came from in the first place. Without a substantial written record and without preserved physical evidence that clearly and directly linked modern Albanians back to a specific ancient population, historians were left working with whatever tools they had available. Linguistics, archaeology, and a considerable amount of educated inference filling in the gaps between them. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, three main competing theories dominated the academic debate. Each one had serious, credentialed supporters, and each one also had serious, unresolved problems. The first theory, and the one most widely accepted by scholars today, holds that Albanians descend from the ancient Illyrians. The Illyrians were a collection of Indo-European tribes who dominated the Western Balkans starting around 1200 BC. They were fierce warriors and skilled sailors on the Adriatic, controlling a substantial stretch of territory running from what is now Slovenia down through the northern reaches of Greece. Several Roman emperors were of Illyrian descent or came from Balkan provincial backgrounds, most notably Diocletian, who built one of the most extraordinary palace complexes in the entire ancient world at what is now Split in modern Croatia, along with several other successors who rose up through the Illyrian ranks of the Roman military to eventually reshape the empire itself from the top down. When Rome fully absorbed Illyrian territories, the Illyrian language began fading out of official use and official records. By roughly the 7th century, it had vanished entirely from the written historical record. The theory holds that it didn't actually die out at all. It simply survived, quietly, transforming over centuries into what we now call the Albanian language. The second competing theory argued that Albanians weren't Illyrian in origin at all, but instead descended from the Thracians, an ancient people who lived in what is now Bulgaria and parts of northern Greece, well to the east of Illyrian territory. Under this model, Albanians would have migrated westward into their current homeland sometime during the post-Roman period, arriving at roughly the same time as the broader Slavic migrations that were reshaping the whole peninsula. That would have made Albanians relative newcomers to the Western Balkans, not ancient, deeply rooted inhabitants of the land at all. The third position tried to split the difference, arguing for a genuinely mixed origin, descendants of multiple ancient Balkan peoples, including contributions from both Illyrian and Thracian populations. It was intellectually honest as far as it went, but frustratingly vague, and without hard supporting evidence behind it, it didn't actually resolve anything for anyone. The whole debate desperately needed something that documents and traditional archaeology simply weren't able to provide on their own. Here's something that needs to be said plainly before we move on to the DNA itself, because it matters enormously for understanding why this all became such a flashpoint. The debate over Albanian origins was never a purely academic exercise. It was never just a quiet question left for historians and linguists to sort out peacefully in university journals over coffee. From the very beginning, the question of where Albanians came from carried enormous, very real political weight. And that political weight shaped the entire debate in ways that had almost nothing to do with the actual evidence on the table. If Albanians were genuinely Illyrian descendants, ancient and indigenous to the Western Balkans, stretching back thousands of years, then their presence in territories like Kosovo was not some medieval accident or opportunistic later arrival. It was a direct continuation of thousands of years of unbroken habitation on that land. That argument mattered enormously, urgently, when Kosovo's political status became one of the single most explosive questions in post-Cold War Europe. The Kosovo War of 1998 to 1999, and Kosovo's subsequent 2008 Declaration of Independence, were both wrapped tightly in competing historical claims about exactly who had been there first, whose roots ran deeper, and whose connection to the land carried more legitimate historical weight. On the other side of that argument, the Thracian migration theory, which placed Albanian origins further east and pushed their arrival in the Western Balkans as late as the 6th or 7th century AD, was politically convenient for anyone who wanted to argue that Albanians were essentially latecomers, that their presence in Kosovo and other contested territories was no more ancient, no more legitimate than the Slavic arrivals of that exact same period. DNA, of course, does not take political sides. Science is fundamentally indifferent to national narratives and territorial claims, but it does produce hard evidence. And evidence in a debate charged with this much political consequence carries weight that extends far, far beyond the walls of any laboratory. Understanding that the origin question had been politically loaded for 2 full centuries helps explain exactly why the genetics study that finally answered it landed with such tremendous force when it arrived. It wasn't simply answering an abstract historical curiosity. It was walking directly into a minefield that generations of careful scholars had been navigating with enormous caution. In June of 2023, a major research paper was published examining the genetic history of the Western Balkans in a level of detail that had genuinely never been attempted before. The study, titled Ancient DNA Reveals the Origins of the Albanians, came out of a research collaboration led by Leonidas Romanos Davranoglu and Alexandros Heraklides at the European University Cyprus, working alongside an international team that included prominent geneticists such as Ian Matheson, Nick Patterson, and David Reich, researchers affiliated with institutions including the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard University, the Broad Institute, and the University of Oxford. This was very deliberately not a small, narrow regional study. The team sequenced and analyzed genetic data spanning over 6,000 ancient West Eurasian genomes, cross-referenced against 74 newly collected DNA samples from present-day ethnic Albanians. 6,000 ancient genomes represents one of the largest datasets ever assembled anywhere in the world for a single population genetics analysis. The work was later formally published in the journal Nature Human Behavior, giving it the full weight of rigorous peer review behind the initial preprint findings. What the team found effectively settled a debate that 2 centuries of pure historical argument had completely failed to resolve. The first and most striking finding was continuity, plain and simple. Albanians today carry a genetic signature that traces directly back to the late Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans, the exact period during which the Illyrians dominated the region politically and culturally. That continuity isn't some minor genetic thread quietly running through Albanian DNA. In the background, it is the dominant, defining feature of their entire genetic profile as a population. The neighboring populations tell a very different story. Bulgarians, Serbians, Greeks, and Macedonians all show clear, detectable genetic breaks somewhere in their DNA record, specific moments where large-scale migration meaningfully altered the underlying population profile of the region. Albanians show traces of those same outside influences too. Nobody living through the Balkans across 3,000 years escapes that entirely. But in the Albanian case, those traces sit layered on top of something considerably older that survived essentially intact underneath them. When researchers actually mapped out the genetic makeup of modern Albanians in detail, what emerged was a portrait built across 3 distinct layers, each one representing a different wave of human movement into the region, across thousands of years. Together, these 3 layers tell the complete story of how Albanian DNA was assembled piece by piece, over time, The first and smallest layer is a modest Neolithic component, tracing back to the very first agricultural communities that spread into Europe out of Anatolia in what is now modern Turkey, somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 years ago. These were the early farming populations that gradually replaced the older hunter-gatherer way of life that had dominated the European continent since the end of the last ice age. In Albanian DNA, this contribution is real, but genuinely modest, a faint signal reaching back to the deepest layer of European prehistory available. The second layer is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, and it is, by far, the dominant component. This layer accounts for roughly 72 to 77% of total Albanian ancestry. It's associated directly with the Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans, the Illyrians, and closely related groups who controlled this region for well over 1,000 years. This is not a minor genetic thread, woven in among others. It is the overwhelming core of Albanian genetic identity. Full stop. No other population anywhere on the Balkan Peninsula carries this specific component at anywhere near this concentration. It's what makes Albanian DNA genuinely, measurably unique in the region. And notably, the deeper research traced that Bronze Age foundation back even further still, showing that these Western Balkan populations themselves carried significant ancestry from Yamnia steppe pastoralists, who had migrated in from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region, arriving in the Western Balkans, starting around 2500 BCE and blending with the earlier Anatolian farming populations already settled there. The third and final layer accounts for approximately 16 to 19% of Albanian ancestry, and it reflects the migrations of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, Germanic groups, Gothic peoples, and Slavic communities who moved through and settled parts of the Balkans between roughly the 4th and 9th centuries. Albanians absorbed a portion of this genetically, as literally any population living through that turbulent period of regional upheaval inevitably would have. But critically, it did not reshape them at any fundamental level. It did not overwrite the older foundation sitting underneath it. That ancient Bronze and Iron Age core held firm, and researchers found this genetic profile was already essentially fixed in place by around 800 CE, remarkably early compared to the rest of the region. The Y chromosome evidence makes that underlying foundation even clearer and even harder to argue with. The Y chromosome passes directly from father to son, generation after generation after generation, with remarkably little change accumulating along the way. That makes it one of the single most precise tools available to population geneticists for tracing direct, unbroken paternal lineages across thousands of years of human history. What this Y chromosome data confirms is not simply ancestry in some loose general sense. It confirms a direct paternal line of descent, running from Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans straight through to modern Albanian men alive today. Not a vague statistical resemblance, not a shared cultural inheritance passed down through stories. Biological one, written directly into the most stable, most slowly changing part of the entire human genome, and preserved intact across more than 2,000 years without being broken. The same research also pinpointed the likely geographic homeland where the Albanian language itself first took shape, pointing specifically toward the Madi region in northern Albania as the probable focal point, further reinforcing the picture of a population that stayed remarkably put, generation after generation, rather than sweeping in from somewhere else entirely. The 2023 DNA study buried that theory, not with vague ambiguity, not with cautious academic hedging about further research being required, with hard, consistent data. There is no genetic signal anywhere in modern Albanian DNA pointing to a large-scale migration originating from the east during the post-Roman period. None whatsoever. If Albanians had genuinely arrived from Thracian territory sometime in the 6th or 7th century, that kind of population movement would have left a clearly detectable genetic signature behind. Migrations of that scale, historically, always do, without exception. The Bronze and Iron Age ancestry that dominates Albanian DNA today was already firmly present in the Western Balkans, continuously for centuries, and centuries before those later dates. The genetic record shows no break, no replacement event, no sudden influx of Eastern ancestry appearing at that specific point in time. What it shows instead is exactly what the Illyrian continuity theory had predicted all along. A population that was already there, already firmly established, already carrying essentially the same genetic profile that modern Albanians carry today, well before the medieval period began reshaping the rest of the Balkan Peninsula around them. The Slavic migrations absolutely did leave detectable genetic traces in Albanian DNA. The three-layer model makes that part of the picture perfectly clear. But those traces sit firmly on top of a foundation that was simply never displaced, never overwritten, never broken. Researchers even noted something else worth mentioning here, that despite 5 full centuries of direct Ottoman rule over Albanian territory, The genetic data shows essentially no detectable Turkish genetic influence woven into the modern Albanian population, a somewhat surprising finding given the length and intensity of that occupation, and one that further underlines just how resistant this particular genetic foundation has been to outside replacement across very different historical eras. The Thracian theory required a population movement that the DNA simply does not support anywhere in the record. And in population genetics, when the evidence lines up this consistently across thousands upon thousands of ancient genomes, the debate is effectively closed. The foundation held. The continuity is real, measurable, and now formally documented in the scientific literature. If you want the single most vivid, tangible proof that Albanian identity is not some modern invention or a medieval accident of history, you honestly don't even need a laboratory to see it. You need to visit a cluster of small villages scattered across the hills of southern Italy. After the death of the Albanian national hero Gjergj Kastrioti Skanderbeg in 1468, and the Ottoman conquest of Albanian territory that followed shortly after, tens of thousands of Albanians fled across the Adriatic Sea and resettled in communities scattered across Sicily, Calabria, and Basilicata. They believed genuinely that the move was temporary. They packed up their language, their faith, and their customs, fully expecting to return home once the Ottoman advance eventually receded. It never did. 600 years later, those same villages still exist today. They're known as the Arboretia communities, and what has survived inside them across those centuries is something scholars still struggle to find adequate words for. The people living there still speak a form of Albanian, but not modern Albanian as it's spoken today. They speak a medieval dialect so archaic, so frozen in time, that a contemporary Albanian speaker listening to it would hear something closer to the language of an earlier historical age than to anything actually spoken in Tirana today. The dialect froze at the exact moment of their departure, and it has been carefully preserved. In those Italian hillside villages ever since, passed down from parent to child across 6 full centuries, without a written standard, without any state support, and without any particular external reason to survive, except that somehow it simply did. These communities still practice Byzantine Rite Christianity, the very same form of worship their ancestors carried with them across the Adriatic all those centuries ago. They still perform traditional dances and maintain cultural ceremonies that have, in some cases, entirely disappeared from Albania itself in the intervening centuries. The renowned Italian intellectual Pier Paolo Pasolini, after hearing the full story of the Arboretia people recounted to him, reportedly called it an anthropological miracle. And having now walked through the full story of Albanian origins, the genetics, the linguistic isolation, the Illyrian continuity stretching back 3,000 years, you understand exactly why he reached for a word that strong. This is what genuine, unbroken cultural continuity actually looks like, sustained across 600 years of exile in a foreign land. Albanians are not some medieval footnote tucked into the margins of European history. They are not a people who simply arrived late and filled a convenient gap left behind by others. The science has spoken here with unusual, striking clarity. From the Bronze Age, foundations embedded directly in their DNA, to the Y chromosomes that match precisely with Iron Age Illyrian burial sites, to the linguistic isolation that only really makes sense if the language itself simply never moved anywhere, to the Arboretia villages of southern Italy still speaking a dialect frozen in the 15th century, every single thread of evidence points firmly in the exact same direction. This is one of the oldest continuously surviving populations anywhere in Europe. A people who absorbed every empire that ever tried to replace them, who outlasted every force that ever tried to erase them, and who arrived into the modern world still carrying genetic and cultural memory that stretches back at least 3,000 years, unbroken. The DNA didn't create that story out of nothing. It confirmed with hard biological evidence